Sarah Collins wiped her brow as she surveyed the newly installed wheelchair ramp leading to her front door. The mid-September sun beat down on the quiet cul-de-sac in Oakwood Estates, where identical two-story colonials stood in perfect formation like soldiers at attention. Her husband, Michael, stepped back, admiring his handiwork. "What do you think? I matched the wood stain to our trim exactly," he said, running his calloused hand along the smooth railing. Sarah's eyes softened. "It's perfect. Eleanor will be able to come and go without any hassle." She checked her watch. Just 3 hours until their sister was scheduled to arrive. Few people in the neighborhood knew that Sarah's older sister was Eleanor Collins, the youngest governor in the state's history. The sisters had always maintained separate lives, Sarah embracing suburban quietude while Eleanor navigated the tumultuous waters of state politics. But they remained close, speaking weekly despite Eleanor's demanding schedule. When water damage had forced renovations at the governor's mansion, Eleanor had surprised Sarah with a phone call. "I need somewhere to stay for about 6 weeks," Eleanor had explained. "Somewhere without cameras and reporters camped outside. Somewhere I can just be Ellie again." Sarah hadn't hesitated. "Stay with us. Michael can make the house accessible." Now, as Sarah walked through her home one last time, she fussed with throw pillows and checked that the guest room was perfectly prepared. Michael had widened doorways, installed grab bars in the bathroom, and made sure furniture was arranged with enough clearance for a wheelchair. They'd converted the downstairs office into a bedroom so Eleanor wouldn't have to navigate stairs. At precisely 4:30 p.m., an unmarked black SUV pulled into the driveway. Sarah watched as her sister's security detail scanned the area before opening the vehicle's door. Eleanor emerged with practiced grace, transferring from the car to her sleek titanium wheelchair with minimal assistance. No fanfare, just as promised, Eleanor called out with a grin, wheeling herself up the newly built ramp. Sarah rushed forward, embracing her sister awkwardly before stepping back to take her in. At 42, Eleanor was 5 years Sarah's senior, but looked younger despite the silver strands beginning to appear in her dark bob. Her tailored blazer and pressed slacks belied the 12-hour day she'd just completed before driving out to the suburbs. The Secret Service guys will do perimeter checks twice daily, but they'll be discreet, Eleanor explained as Michael carried in her luggage. "I've convinced them to stay at a hotel instead of camping in your living room." "How generous of them," Michael quipped, earning a laugh from his sister-in-law. Later that evening, after a simple dinner of Eleanor's favourite lasagna, the sisters sat on the back patio with glasses of wine. The security detail had retreated to the edges of the property, giving them privacy in the gathering dusk. "I can't tell you how good it feels to be somewhere normal," Eleanor sighed. No official residence, no staff hovering, no cameras. Sarah watched as tension visibly melted from her sister's shoulders. "How long before anyone figures out you're here?" Eleanor shrugged. "My office is releasing that I'm staying at a private location during renovations. My public schedule is light for the next few weeks, mostly virtual appearances I can do from here." She gestured toward her laptop bag. "As far as the press knows, I could be anywhere." Neither sister noticed Mr. Keller from across the street, president of the Oakwood Estates HOA, watching them through parted curtains. His attention was fixed not on the governor, whom he didn't recognize from this distance, but on the new wooden ramp constructed without proper authorization forms crossing his desk first. As darkness fell, Sarah helped Eleanor settle into her temporary bedroom, both women blissfully unaware of the storm gathering just beyond their doorstep. The Collins family settled into a comfortable routine over the next 2 days. Eleanor conducted virtual meetings from the makeshift office space Sarah had created in the corner of the living room, while Sarah worked from home to help her sister acclimate to the new environment. Michael left early each morning for his construction business, but returned promptly at 5, often bearing takeout from Eleanor's favourite local restaurants. On Wednesday afternoon, Sarah was sorting through mail when she heard a sharp knock at the front door. Finding no one there when she answered, she noticed a white envelope taped to the doorframe, the Oakwood Estates HOA logo prominently displayed in the corner. Thinking it was probably a community newsletter or notice about upcoming landscaping work, she tucked it under her arm and continued sorting bills. It wasn't until after dinner, when Eleanor had retreated to her room for an important conference call, that Sarah remembered the envelope. Tearing it open at the kitchen table, her expression shifted from casual interest to confusion to outrage as she read. "You have got to be kidding me," she muttered, handing the letter to Michael. The notice, printed on heavy cardstock with an embossed letterhead, cited Section 7, Paragraph 3 of the Oakwood Estates Covenant regarding unauthorized exterior modifications. It specifically referenced the wheelchair ramp as a non-conforming structure erected without proper review and approval. The letter, signed by Richard Keller, HOA president, demanded removal within 7 days or daily fines of $200 would commence. "This is ridiculous," Michael said, reading the citation. "The ADA specifically protects reasonable modifications for accessibility." Sarah grabbed her laptop and pulled up the community bylaws she'd saved when they purchased the house 3 years ago. After 30 minutes of searching, she found nothing that explicitly prohibited ramps or required special approval for accessibility modifications. "I'm calling first thing tomorrow," she said, jaw set in determination. "This has to be a misunderstanding." Morning came, and after ensuring Eleanor was comfortable and set up for her day of virtual meetings, Sarah made the call to the HOA office. After being placed on hold for 17 minutes, she finally reached Marjorie, Richard Keller's assistant. "I'm calling about this notice regarding our wheelchair ramp," Sarah began, keeping her voice level despite her frustration. "Yes, the Collins residence on Maple Drive," Marjorie responded, her voice crisp and detached. "The board has determined the structure was built without proper authorization and does not conform to community aesthetic guidelines." "My sister needs that ramp to enter and exit our home," Sarah explained. "She uses a wheelchair and the Americans with Disabilities Act." "Mrs. Collins," Marjorie interrupted, "exceptions cannot be made regardless of personal circumstances. The board is very clear on this matter." "Could I schedule a meeting with Mr. Keller or the board?" Sarah asked, trying a different approach. "The next board meeting is Friday at 6 p.m. at the community centre. You may have 3 minutes during the public comment period to address your concerns." After ending the call, Sarah sat at the kitchen table, hands shaking with a mixture of anger and anxiety. She hadn't mentioned Eleanor's identity. Her sister had always been protective of her privacy, and Sarah respected that. But she hadn't expected such inflexibility over something as necessary as accessibility. When Eleanor wheeled into the kitchen for lunch, she immediately noticed Sarah's expression. "What's wrong?" she asked, concern etching her features. Sarah hesitated. Eleanor had enough stress managing state affairs remotely. The last thing she needed was a petty neighbourhood dispute. "Nothing important," Sarah replied, forcing a smile. "Just some HOA nonsense about the garden. I'll handle it." Outside, through the kitchen window, she could see Richard Keller slowly driving past their house in his silver Mercedes, neck craned to study the ramp with obvious disapproval. Sarah felt a chill despite the warm September air. There was something in his deliberate surveillance that suggested this wouldn't be resolved with a simple conversation. That night, she stayed up late researching accessibility laws and preparing her case for Friday's meeting, determined to protect her sister's dignity without having to leverage Eleanor's position. Little did she know that Richard Keller had already made up his mind, and no regulation or law would change it. Friday evening arrived with an unusual chill for September. Sarah had spent the past 2 days compiling research, printouts of federal accessibility laws, the community bylaws with relevant sections highlighted, and a letter from Eleanor's doctor explaining the necessity of the ramp. She hadn't told Eleanor about the meeting, instead making up a story about a neighborhood potluck when her sister asked why Michael was rushing home early from work. The Oakwood Estates Community Center was a stately brick building with pristine white columns flanking the entrance. Sarah noted the irony as she and Michael climbed the steps. There was no wheelchair access visible from the front. Inside, approximately 20 residents were scattered across rows of folding chairs. At the front, behind a long table covered in dark blue cloth, sat the 5 HOA board members. Richard Keller occupied the center seat, a man in his 60s with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses that he periodically removed to polish with a monogrammed handkerchief. On his right sat Victoria Simmons, a former real estate agent known for her meticulous garden and frequent complaints about other residents' lawn care. "Let's call this meeting to order," Keller announced precisely at 6 p.m., tapping a small gavel. After proceeding through routine business for 45 minutes, he finally reached the public comment section. "Mrs. Collins," he called, consulting his agenda, "you have 3 minutes regarding an unauthorized structure." Sarah approached the podium, hands trembling slightly as she arranged her documents. Michael gave her an encouraging nod from his seat. "Thank you for this opportunity to speak," she began. "I'm here about the notice regarding our wheelchair ramp. My sister is temporarily staying with us and requires the ramp for basic access to our home. As you can see from these documents, the Americans with Disabilities Act specifically protects modifications made for accessibility purposes." She slid copies of her research across the table. Victoria Simmons barely glanced at the papers. The ADA applies to public accommodations, not private communities with established aesthetic guidelines. Actually, Sarah countered, the Fair Housing Act amendments specifically address this situation. Reasonable modifications for disabled persons cannot be prohibited, even by HOA covenants. Keller removed his glasses, fixing Sarah with a cold stare. "Mrs. Collins, I've been president of this association for 11 years. Property values in Oakwood Estates have increased 28% under my leadership, precisely because we maintain strict standards. I understand aesthetics are important," Sarah replied, "but surely accessibility." "The ramp is visible from the street," Victoria interrupted. "It disrupts the architectural harmony we've worked hard to maintain. It's made of the same materials as our porch and stained to match exactly," Michael interjected from his seat. Keller's eyes narrowed. "Sir, please wait to be recognized before speaking." Sarah pulled out the doctor's letter. "I have documentation of medical necessity. Save your amateur legal threats for someone who's intimidated by them," Keller said dismissively. "Your 3 minutes are up." "But I haven't finished presenting." "Perhaps," Victoria Simmons cut in, her voice dripping with false concern, "people with special needs should consider communities better suited to their lifestyle rather than expecting everyone else to accommodate them." A shocked murmur rippled through the room. Even some board members looked uncomfortable with Simmons' statement. "That's discriminatory and potentially illegal," Sarah said, her voice rising. Keller tapped his gavel sharply. "That's quite enough, Mrs. Collins. The board will take your concerns under advisement and render a decision within 10 business days. Next item." Sarah Gavater ignored documents with shaking hands. As she turned to leave, Keller added, "In the meantime, the notice stands. 7 days for removal, which by my count gives you until Wednesday." In the parking lot, Sarah finally let the tears flow. They didn't even look at the documentation. She whispered as Michael wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "That wasn't a hearing, it was a performance," Michael said grimly. "They'd made up their minds before we walked in." Neither noticed board member Thomas Wilson watching them from the doorway, conflict evident on his face. As the youngest and newest member of the board, he'd said nothing during the exchange, but Victoria's comment about people with special needs had disturbed him deeply. His mother used a wheelchair after her stroke last year. As Sarah and Michael drove home, a heavy silence between them, they faced an impossible decision. Tell Eleanor and risk unnecessary stress during a critical time in her governorship, or continue trying to handle it themselves with time rapidly running out. Sarah awoke Monday morning to the harsh mechanical whine of power tools. Disoriented, she glanced at the bedside clock. 6:38 a.m. Michael had already left for an early meeting with clients, and Eleanor wasn't typically up before 7. The noise continued, a rhythmic grinding punctuated by the thud of wood hitting concrete. Throwing on a robe over her pajamas, Sarah hurried downstairs and flung open the front door. What she saw made her stomach drop. 3 men in grey uniforms were systematically dismantling the wheelchair ramp. One operated a circular saw, cutting through the railings, while another pried boards loose with a crowbar. The third loaded the dismantled pieces into the bed of a pickup truck with Oakwood Estates Maintenance stenciled on the door. "Stop," Sarah shouted, rushing outside barefoot. "What are you doing?" "You can't do this." The workers paused, exchanging uncomfortable glances. The oldest of the 3, a weathered man with salt and pepper hair, approached her. "Ma'am, we're just following orders," he said, pulling a clipboard from his back pocket. "We have a work order to remove non-compliant structures at this address." Sarah snatched the clipboard, scanning the document with growing horror. The removal order, authorized by Richard Keller, cited her failure to respond to multiple notices and willful non-compliance with community standards. It was dated Saturday, the day after the meeting. "This is illegal," Sarah's voice shook. "We were given until Wednesday and are still in the appeals process. You can't just—" "Look, lady," the foreman interrupted, reclaiming his clipboard. "I don't make the rules. Mr. Keller called this in as a priority job yesterday afternoon. If you have complaints, take them up with the HOA office." Sarah pulled out her phone with trembling fingers, first trying Michael, then the HOA office. Michael's phone went straight to voicemail. He was likely in his client meeting. The HOA office recording informed her they opened at 9 a.m. "You need to stop until I reach someone," Sarah insisted. "My sister is inside and needs that ramp to exit the house." The foreman shrugged. "Not my problem. We have 3 more jobs after this today." As they resumed dismantling the structure, Sarah heard the mechanical whir of Eleanor's wheelchair behind her. She turned to see her sister framed in the doorway, watching the scene with an unreadable expression. "What's happening?" Eleanor asked, her voice calm but tight. Before Sarah could answer, she heard the squeal of brakes as Michael's truck skidded into the driveway. He must have checked his messages between meetings. He leaped out, face contorted with rage as he surveyed the destruction. "Who authorized this?" he demanded, striding toward the workers. "That ramp is on private property," HOA easement extends 6 feet from the sidewalk. The foreman replied, unfazed by Michael's anger. It's all in the covenant you signed when you bought the house. By now, several neighbours had emerged from their homes, watching the confrontation from a distance. Sarah noticed Mrs. Peterson from across the street recording with her phone. Michael positioned himself between the workers and what remained of the ramp. Less than half of the structure was still intact. I'm calling the police, he said. This is destruction of private property. Go ahead, the foreman replied. We have proper authorization. Police will just tell you it's a civil matter. Eleanor wheeled herself to the edge of the porch, but could go no further. The half-demolished ramp now ended in jagged boards 3 feet above the ground. Sarah moved to her sister's side, whispering, I'm so sorry. I didn't want to worry you with this. Eleanor's eyes narrowed as she surveyed the scene. The workers continuing their demolition despite Michael's protests, the neighbours watching with mixtures of sympathy and curiosity, the bureaucratic violence of it all. Without a word, she reversed her wheelchair and disappeared back into the house. By 7:30 am, the destruction was complete. The workers had not only removed the entire ramp, but had left the splintered materials scattered across the lawn, boards with exposed nails, cut railings, and concrete anchor debris, creating both an eyesore and a safety hazard. The foreman handed Michael a citation for improper material storage before driving away. As the truck disappeared down the street, Sarah stood stunned in the doorway. Through the window she could see Eleanor at the dining room table, phone pressed to her ear, speaking intently while typing rapidly on her laptop. Her sister's expression had transformed from shock to something Sarah recognized from news footage of Eleanor handling state crisis. Cold, calculated determination. By late afternoon, Sarah had cleared most of the debris from their lawn, while Michael installed a temporary wooden plank as a makeshift exit ramp. Not ideal, but functional enough for emergencies. Eleanor had been sequestered in the dining room for hours, the murmur of intense phone conversations occasionally drifting through the closed door. Should we be worried? Michael asked quietly as he and Sarah sat on the front steps, surveying their work. Sarah shook her head. I've only seen her like this once before, when that factory tried to dump chemicals in the river. The CEO ended up personally funding the cleanup. At 4:15 p.m., Richard Keller began his daily neighbourhood inspection tour. Sarah watched him cruise down the street in his Mercedes, stopping to place violation notices on 2 mailboxes and photographing a garbage can left visible from the street. His vehicle slowed as he approached their house, a satisfied smirk visible as he noted the missing ramp. Simultaneously, a white news van with the Channel 7 logo turned onto their street. Then another from Channel 4. Within minutes, 3 more media vehicles had arrived, reporters and camera operators spilling onto the sidewalk. Richard Keller's Mercedes came to an abrupt halt. He watched, confusion evident on his face, as journalists began setting up equipment on the public easement in front of Sarah's house. A young reporter approached Keller's car. Mr. Keller, Rebecca Winters from Channel 7. We'd like your comment on the governor situation. Keller rolled down his window. What governor situation? The accessibility rights violation in your community, she clarified, gesturing toward the Collins house. We understand the HOA destroyed Governor Collins' wheelchair access this morning without proper notice or accommodation. The colour drained from Keller's face. Governor Collins? I don't understand. Governor Eleanor Collins, the reporter continued, her cameraman positioning for a better angle. Her office issued a statement 30 minutes ago about discriminatory housing practices in Oakwood Estates. They mentioned you specifically. Keller's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he glanced toward the house, finally registering why the woman in the wheelchair had seemed vaguely familiar. "There's been a misunderstanding," he stammered. "The HOA simply enforces community standards." "Is it your community's standard to violate federal accessibility laws?" Another reporter called out, joining the impromptu sidewalk press conference. Inside the house, Eleanor was finalizing arrangements with her chief of staff. "Have Jessica draft the executive order for my signature tomorrow. And tell Ben I want the task force assembled by Thursday." Sarah entered with a glass of water. "There are news vans outside." Eleanor nodded. "I made some calls." "How many calls exactly?" The State Attorney General, the head of the Disability Rights Coalition, 3 news directors, and the legislative leadership for both parties. Eleanor took the water with a tired smile. "I had planned to keep my stay here quiet, but some things are more important than privacy." The doorbell rang. Through the peephole, Sarah saw Victoria Simmons standing on their porch, her normally perfect posture now rigid with anxiety. "Mrs. Collins," Victoria said when Sarah opened the door, "I wonder if we might discuss this situation like reasonable people without involving the media." From inside, Eleanor's voice carried clearly. "Is that Victoria Simmons? The one who suggested people with disabilities should live elsewhere? Please invite her in. I'd love to discuss reasonable accommodation with her." Victoria blanched, suddenly recognizing Eleanor's voice from her frequent appearances on local news. As Victoria retreated hastily to her car, Thomas Wilson, the young HOA board member, approached the house. Unlike Victoria, his expression held genuine remorse. "Mrs. Collins," he addressed Sarah, "I needed to tell you in person. I resigned from the board an hour ago. What happened here was wrong." Eleanor wheeled herself to the door. "Mr. Wilson, I'm Eleanor Collins. Would you be willing to make a statement about the board's deliberation process? My chief of staff is drafting an executive order about discriminatory housing practices, and first-hand testimony would be valuable." By sunset, the scene in front of the Collins house had transformed into an impromptu press conference. Michael had carried Eleanor down the steps, a moment captured by multiple cameras, and placed her in a chair at a hastily assembled podium. "What happened today isn't just about me," Eleanor told the assembled reporters, her voice clear and authoritative. "It's about every person with disabilities who has been told they don't belong, or that their needs are inconvenient." From his driveway 3 houses down, Richard Keller watched the broadcast in progress, the realization of what he had done, and who he had done it to, finally sinking in. The sunrise bathed Oakwood Estates in golden light as an unusual flurry of activity disrupted the neighborhood's typical Tuesday morning quiet. A convoy of trucks bearing the logo of Martinez Construction pulled up in front of the Collins residence, followed by 2 vans from the state's Department of Equal Rights and Accessibility. Sarah stood on the front porch, clutching her coffee mug as she watched at least 20 workers unload materials and equipment. Michael greeted Carlos Martinez, his former colleague from trade school, who now ran the largest construction company in the state. "When the governor calls, you answer," Carlos said with a grin, unrolling blueprints across the hood of his truck. "But I would have come anyway after hearing what happened. This design incorporates all ADA best practices, while matching your home's aesthetic perfectly." By 8 a.m., the construction crew had roped off a section of the front yard and begun work. Neighbors emerged from their homes, watching with mixtures of curiosity and embarrassment. Mrs. Peterson, who had filmed the ramp's destruction, approached Sarah with a casserole dish. "I'm so sorry I didn't speak up yesterday," she said, eyes downcast. I've seen how that HOA board operates, but I was afraid of becoming their next target. Inside, Eleanor was conducting back-to-back video conferences for the dining room. Her security detail had doubled overnight, with agents now visibly stationed at the perimeter of the property. The story had gone national, with #RampGate trending across social media platforms. At precisely 10 a.m., Eleanor signed the executive order she had promised, broadcast live from Sarah's dining room table. Today I am establishing an accessibility rights task force with emergency powers to review all HOA regulations across our state for compliance with federal and state disability laws, she announced, her voice steady and authoritative. No one should ever have to justify their right to enter or exit their own home. By noon, the State Attorney General held a press conference announcing a formal investigation into the Oakwood Estates HOA for multiple violations of the Fair Housing Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and state accessibility statutes. Richard Keller's name was specifically mentioned in connection with potential civil rights violations. At 2 p.m., an emergency meeting of Oakwood Estates residents convened at the community centre. The attendance was unprecedented. Over 200 homeowners packed the room, spilling into the hallways. Thomas Wilson, though no longer a board member, presented a petition signed by 178 residents demanding the immediate resignation of the entire HOA board. This incident has revealed a deeper problem in our community, he told the agitated crowd. Rules meant to protect our property values have been weaponized to exclude and discriminate. When Richard Keller attempted to call the meeting to order, he was met with a chorus of boos. Victoria Simmons was nowhere to be seen, having reportedly left town for an unexpected family emergency. By meeting's end, the entire board had resigned, and an interim committee was established to revise the community bylaws completely. Back at the Collins house, the new ramp took shape with remarkable speed. Carlos had brought in specialized crews who typically worked on government accessibility projects. By sunset, a beautifully crafted ramp with gentle slopes and sturdy railings curved elegantly from the front door to the sidewalk, its design complementing the house so seamlessly it looked as though it had always been there. "It's better than I could have imagined," Sarah told Michael as they watched the final touches being applied. "But part of me wishes it hadn't taken all this to get here." 6 months later, on a crisp spring afternoon, the Collins backyard was transformed with strings of lights, long tables covered in white cloths, and a banner reading, "Collins Accessibility Act Celebration." The governor's security detail maintained a discreet perimeter as over 50 guests. Disability rights advocates, legislators, and neighbours gathered for a community barbecue. Eleanor, now back in the governor's mansion, but visiting for the occasion, raised a glass from her position at the head table. Today marks the signing of the Collins Accessibility Act, ensuring that no resident of our state will ever face discrimination based on their mobility needs. Applause erupted across the gathering. Sarah noticed Thomas Wilson among the guests. He had been appointed to head the new state office of housing accessibility rights. Even Mrs. Peterson had brought her famous potato salad and was deep in conversation with a representative from the Disability Rights Coalition about retrofitting the community playground. As the celebration continued, Sarah found a quiet moment with her sister near the garden. "When you came to stay with us, I never imagined it would lead to all this," she said. Eleanor smiled, watching the diverse gathering of people who had come together because of what had happened. Sometimes it takes a personal experience to show us where systems are broken. She reached over to squeeze Sarah's hand. "Thank you for trying to protect me, but I'm glad I got to fight this one in the open." From across the yard, Michael approached with Carlos Martinez, both men gesturing animatedly as they discussed plans for a new non-profit that would build free accessibility modifications for low-income homeowners, funded largely by the settlement from their successful lawsuit against the former Oakwood Estates HOA board. The sun began to set over the neighborhood, a community forever changed by what had begun as one family's simple need for a ramp.